Is it now, or was it then common for senior Navy officers to attend events at which prostitutes and women in scantily clad outfits were expected to provide entertainment?
The Justice Department saying, quote, during the party, historic memorabilia related to General Douglas MacArthur was used in sexual acts.
Everybody was in my pocket. I had them in my palm. I was just rolling them around.
That's Leonard Glenn Francis. For years, his company supplied $20 billion aircraft carriers with food, fuel, and security. And Leonard became exorbitantly wealthy.
I had the Navy by their balls. I turned my torpedo, my guns against them because they betrayed me.
With nothing to lose, Leonard sparing no details. Check out Fat Leonard from Project Brazen and PRX on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
Malaysia and followers from around the world. It is known as the Fat Leonard scandal and is said to be the biggest scandal in US Navy history. Behind this scandal is a Malaysian, unfortunately, and of course, also from Penang, like Jolo and myself. He's known as Fat Leonard, but his real name is Leonard Glenn Francis. And he was known as Fat because that he was weighing around 350 pounds. It's much more slimmer now, of course. He provided cash, prostitutes, travel expenses, luxury items, and concert tickets, Lady Gaga concert, in return for lucrative contracts from the US Navy officers, including those from the US 7th Fleet, which patrols the Pacific, Indian Ocean, and even the South China Sea. He was even given classified material about the movement of US ships and submarines. Who is this Fat Leonard, who used to be able to charm and move his way around the top echelons of the US elites, US Navy elites? And what has he been doing? Joining us tonight, of course, is the award-winning journalist, Tom Wright, who is the co-author of this famous book about Jolo. We're privileged to have him on board. He'll be telling us about the updates of his podcast, an exclusive podcast with this man. Tom, let's start the conversation. The floor is yours.
Hey, well, great. Thanks for having me. You know, first of all, I should say Fat Leonard wasn't known as Fat Leonard when he was doing this business with the Navy. He did this business for a long time, going all the way back to the late 1980s, when he was, a young man working for his family's shipping business in Penang. And they were doing, commercial shipping back then, the Greek ships, the ships that were just coming in and out of Asia. And his story is an extraordinary one, and it hasn't really been told yet. So I got access to Leonard earlier this year and have spent over 20 hours talking to him for this podcast, which is coming out on October the 5th. And yeah, he wasn't known as Fat Leonard. He was known as Leonard the Legend because, he was called the Westpac Legend, the Western Pacific Legend, because he became a monopoly for the US Navy in this part of the world. And it's it's a slightly complicated story, but in short, what happened was when the US shut the Subic Bay port in the Philippines in the early 1990s, they didn't really have anywhere to do rest and recuperation, R&R for their sailors, and to train. So Leonard was very useful for the US Navy. He opened up Bali, for example, for them. He opened up Malaysia, the first aircraft carrier visit to Port Klang in the late 90s. He worked in Singapore, where he set up his business, Glenn Defense Marine Asia. Then after the September the 11th attacks, and if you remember the year before those, there was an attack on the USS Cole, which was an aircraft carrier in Yemen. The US Navy was extremely worried about Al-Qaeda attacks on its ships. So Leonard protected the fleet. It's another job he started to do because he was what's called a husbanding agent. He would do food, fuel. He would take off the trash and the sewage from boats, do all of that kind of thing, security in ports. But then he started to actually protect the ships from Al-Qaeda attacks on the sea side. So he would put what was called a ring of steel around the ships, which were these steel buoys. And he started to charge, hundreds of thousands of dollars per ship visit, if not even millions. And his profits, this is in the 2000s, just started to pile up and pile up and pile up. Now, at the same time, he was running a con because he was taking out officers all the time, plying them with prostitutes, Cohiba cigars, Hennessy cognac, hotels, paid vacations, all of this stuff that's been reported. And in return, those officers were making sure that the ships went to ports that he controlled. And he again started to charge like huge amounts. There's one anecdote in the podcast where the USS Nimitz, the largest aircraft carrier in the world, wants to go to India, but the US Navy can't find one husbanding agent to do the job in the whole of India that they can trust. So Leonard goes from Singapore with an entire flotilla of ships to help, and he charges $5 million. So that's why he's a legend. And then he ends up living on Nassim Road, number 40 Nassim Road, the former Saudi embassy. It's $170 million Singapore dollar property next to Ong Beng's.
Where's this Nassim Road?
Nassim Road in Singapore. Yeah, so it's the road which leads from Orchard Road to the Botanic Gardens. His neighbor was Ong Beng Seng, obviously the billionaire. So suddenly he's living in this crazily, upper echelons of Singapore society. He has like 20 luxury cars, Bentleys and Rolls Royces, and this was solely from doing US military business. So if you think about it, the pullout from Afghanistan that's just happened, and the $2 trillion that was spent there with few results. Leonard is a symbol of the war on terror. He benefited from that incredible increase in spending.
Tom, there was one report that I read, and this former commander of the 7th Fleet, he says that he was our crook. He was a crook, but he was our crook in many ways, that he supplied and what was needed by the Navy. And he was, as you say, that he played a big role in making sure that the fleet was secured. How did he manage to be so trusted by these US Navy officers?
Well, I'm going to tell you, the podcast really doesn't show Leonard in a great light in some ways, and we'll get to that later. There's some very troubling parts of this story that have never been reported before that will come out in the podcast. But, he also was very successful at his job. What you're referring to a commander called Michael Misiewicz,
Correct, yes.
who's just got
operating officer.
Yeah, he's just got out of jail, I believe, and he's a big part of our podcast as well. So what Misiewicz is saying, he went to jail for colluding with Leonard, for giving him classified ship schedules, and in return taking prostitutes and dinners. But what he's saying is Leonard was of great use to the U.S. Navy. If you want to go, one of the great secrets of the Navy is, if you want to go into a port that isn't your own port, like San Diego, you have to rely on the governments and the authorities in those places, and often they want backhand payments and corruption payments. So when the Navy wanted to go into Thailand or various places, Leonard was the bagman for them. So, for example, Misiewicz organized a visit for one of the, I think it was the Stennis, the USS Stennis, to John Stennis, to go to Kota Kinabalu, to the port there. I think it's called Sepanggar, isn't it? Something like that.
Yeah. This is where the Malaysian submarine is based. So for optic purposes, it was really good because it's almost at the edge of the South China Sea.
Exactly. So this was in 2011, I believe. Leonard, he facilitates a visit for this US aircraft carrier, I think the first ever, to go into a Malaysian port very close to the South China Sea at a time when China is saber rattling. So that's why Misiewicz said he was a crook, but he was our crook. He was, Leonard was loyal to the US for sure throughout his 30-year career. And he made a lot of money doing it, but he also ripped off the US taxpayer, to at least $30 million, which is what he's, his restitution. But yes, Misiewicz is a fascinating character. Should we talk a little bit about him?
Sure, yeah.
Well, he was a refugee from Cambodia. He had grown up during the killing fields. He was a little kid in 1970s when Pol Pot took over, and he was adopted into an American army family. And he was a great American immigrant success story, but he sort of ends up in Leonard's craw and becoming, getting extremely corrupted by Leonard. And I won't give too much away because this comes in episode 5 of the podcast. But his wife, a woman called Marcy Misiewicz, has a huge part to play in this story and in Leonard's downfall. And so we reveal for the first time in the podcast her role in how her interactions with her husband actually led to the NCIS getting onto Leonard's case and that leading to Leonard's arrest.
Tom, for some reason, it sounds familiar. Okay, Tom, I've been following this his case, okay, but the court proceeding keeps on postponing. So I'm trying to understand what is the exact judicial decision on Tom, but because the case has been postponed many times, and if from what I've read, if I'm not mistaken, has he become a prosecution witness?
Well, we should say let the listeners know a little bit what happened. So he was arrested in 2013, and again, we'll describe in more detail how that happened. But he was brought to San Diego for meetings. Excuse me.
Yeah.
And he was arrested in a Marriott hotel in San Diego by the FBI for this whole scam of like bribing and padding invoices and overcharging and all of this. After about a year, he decided to plead guilty and he started to cooperate with the FBI with their investigations. So he's become a cooperating witness. But he actually came to me earlier this year via a Malaysian intermediary because he is extremely frustrated with waiting around. He's been under house arrest, jail, and now house arrest for 8 years. And these trials that he's the witness in keep getting postponed. They were supposed to happen in November. Now they've been postponed to February. And the main reason for the postponements are, I think the US government doesn't want a trial. It wants all of those US Navy officers that were involved with him to plead guilty and then have no trial. So for most, for the last 8 years since Leonard was arrested, there's been about 30 Navy officers have been indicted. And there's only 7 now who are pleading not guilty. And their trial is supposed to happen in February. But of course, this podcast is gonna change things for the trial because he's talking in public. So
okay, as a journalist, of course, I'm interested as to how you manage. Of course, you mentioned a Malaysian contact, but to get him to talk, and to spend so many hours with him, as a journalist, I'd like to know. Perhaps you can share a bit about how you managed to put all this together.
Well, so Leonard has his own reasons for wanting to talk, which to me are slightly inscrutable, really, given that he was a government witness in this case. He's also sick. He has kidney cancer, and I'm not 100% sure whether it's terminal but I think he's been kept alive by drugs, or at least that's what he says. So I think that also plays into it. I think he feels wronged by the US Navy because he says, I did a great job all these years protecting the fleet, and there was corruption, which he admits to fully in the podcast. But that was a corruption that was expected and wasn't. I didn't invent it. That's his. Now it's a very self-serving argument, and we're very careful in the podcast to sort of question a lot. And we talk to many other people apart from Leonard. This is not just like Leonard Francis's story. But there is a grain of truth in the fact that he was supported from very, very high level admirals. So another thing we get into in the podcast is, has there been a cover up? Because if you look at the kinds of people that have gone to jail, we talked to one guy called David Kapoun, who just got out of jail, 18 months. He was a commander in Singapore, based in Singapore. He's furious because he's done 18 months for some, he slept with a prostitute that Leonard provided. He did some. I think he failed to declare his connections to Leonard to investigators, and he got done for that in the end, did 18 months. There are admirals, 2-star admirals and others who did very similar things and did not face anything but getting a letter of censure from the Navy. And so, we hope this podcast will spark more of a debate about this unbelievable rot that there was in the Navy's Pacific Fleet. And how do you stop that happening again? You don't do that by brushing it under the carpet.
Tom, I'm given to understand that in the US, this kind of billion-dollar deals happens almost all the time, and that there are many other defense contractors like Leonard, and they have been ripping off the public. The taxpayers have been paying billions of dollars for many of these US defense contracts, purchasing of arms, purchasing of bullets, and these kind of services. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, if you look at US defense spending, it really ramped up incredibly after the first Gulf War in the early 1990s. So we go back in the podcast and we look at the history of the Navy going back to the 90s. And so Leonard was in the right place at the right time. And he, you know, like we were saying about his wealth, his immense wealth, it's very strange to me that you could be that wealthy doing a US government contracting business. But of course, the first Gulf War happened, and then you know, and Leonard is quoted in the podcast. You know, he says, "You don't have to make money; they'll just give it to you. Nobody cares. There's no due diligence. It's just Uncle Sam's money." That's what he says, and he paints this picture of, you know, people signing off on things because it was just hypothetical money to everybody, because it was this gusher of cash coming. And then, you know, the other thing is that I think we show in the podcast is that. I don't know whether this might be contentious. People might not agree with me, but I think that the 7th Fleet, they were not doing, at least those guys who we're not talking about low-level sailors here. These were the chief of staff, the people running the 7th Fleet. They had a boat called the USS Blue Ridge, which is, they controlled the 7th Fleet from that boat. You know, that boat was just going from port to port, having parties. You know, I talked to a guy just 2 days ago who just got out of jail as well. And he said, our job was to party. You know, that's what he told me. So, you know, there's incredible cultural rot in the organization, which I think that, you know, really needs to be discussed, because, you know, obviously right now the U.S. Navy plays a very, very important role in the Pacific, in counterbalancing China in all kinds of different ways, right? So these are all the issues we were very interested in.
Tom, back to my question about your interview with him. This was done through physical or through Zoom?
Well, we didn't use Zoom. We used another similar product. We got him a microphone and sent it to him, and he recorded locally, and we recorded locally. So you get studio quality sound. You know, he's in house arrest, not in a high security prison. So he's got some ability to do that. But like I said, I found it very hard to pass his motivations for talking, given his position.
But you do see him speak.
Yes, like I see you now.
What caught your eyes the most? You know, that when you talk to a person like him, obviously he's very persuasive, he's very eloquent, and that's how people who pitch sales are like. But what caught you most when you spoke to him?
Well, he's very charming. And I think the key to his success, apart from, you know, being a workaholic and doing a good job for the Navy, was he's very charming. But and again, I don't want to give too much away, but as I got to know him and as I researched his life and especially his treatment of women, I became shocked. And one of, you know, in episode 6, which is, you know, it's a 9-episode podcast, is a shocking episode about Leonard's own family life. And so I became shocked by some of the things I learned about him. And our relationship, you know, my relationship with him is rocky as well, because, you know, we started off learning about him, learning about his business. But by the end of the sort of 9 months of talking to each other, it became our relationship became very testy.
I see. His family life story was beginning from Penang.
He was born. He grew up in Penang and Singapore. He moved between. So his family story is that his grandfather on his father's side was Scottish and had worked on the rubber plantations in I believe Perak. And so that was a sort of the poor side of the family. But his mother's side were Portuguese Sri Lankans, and so they had a shipping company in Singapore. His grandfather on his mother's side had a shipping company in Singapore, and so he grew up in this shipping world. So yes, it is in Penang, but it's also in Singapore as well, where he moved. He moved to Singapore in the 90s and then lived there from then on.
I'm also quite fascinated to read that he was jailed for having arms possession. Most cases this was during the 80s, I think,
yes.
That for armor possession, if it was an unlawful illegal possession, he would have been sentenced to death. But he managed to get off quite lightly.
Well,
in this
not
case?
well. Yeah, he did get out, but he tells the whole story on the podcast in the first episode, where he takes part in an armed robbery of a moneylenders in Penang. So they wait for the moneylenders to come out of the shop with the money. They follow them, and Leonard's the getaway driver. He hires he hires a Volvo from Budget Rent a Car, and he's got a bulletproof vest, and there's a bunch of triads in the back. They pull up and pretend to have broken down, and then the moneylenders come along. They jump out with the guns, and they throw the bags out over the Penang Bridge and head off to some kampung on the Butterworth side, where the triads are from. But anyway, Leonard ends up with the guns and the money, and the police find it. So he ends up in jail. He ends up doing a year in jail. But he thought he was going to get hung because, he was in jail in Penang on death row because of gun possession was a capital crime. And for some reason he gets off. I think his family pulls some strings. He gets off, and then he starts his Navy business. So I think he's an extreme risk taker. This guy, he
really colorful character.
Yeah, I think he takes, he'll take huge risks, and that's how, later on in his career, and we don't really get into this in the podcast, he bought the Penang Port Klang cruise terminal or cruise center from Genting, and he was going to turn that into his own port, right? So he has very, very big ambitions, basically. Always.
Okay, Tom, tell us about this podcast, and it's been called the Brazen Project, right? Tell us a bit about that and the podcast. How long would it last? How many episodes, and how is it going to be made available to the public? And how would one be able to subscribe and listen to it?
Okay, if you want to listen to it, it's coming out on October the 5th, which is Tuesday, not next Tuesday, a week after. Oh, sorry, we're talking on Wednesday. So it's from when this is going to be published, from when this talk is going to be published, it's going to be coming out the following Tuesday. So you can get it on Apple or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts, Stitcher. So it should be freely. It's free. You don't have to pay for it. So yeah, if everyone can subscribe, I think they're going to really enjoy this. Project Brazen is a company that I set up with Bradley Hope, who with the co-authors of $1 Billion Whale. Bradley's based in London and I'm in Singapore. And we have a slate of really exciting true stories that we're developing for adaptation for TV and film. Fat Leonard is one of them, and Bradley's working on a book about a crazy North Korean story of espionage. And then we've got like a whole slew of things we're doing with some with partners, some by ourselves. So yeah, but podcasts is part of it, but we're also doing, still writing, still doing books, still doing articles.
As somebody who loves visual, okay, and I love my hard copy, okay. So of course, I'm wondering, and I will want to see what they call it, the interview in a visual manner, and of course to read a book about him. Is this part of the pipeline about Fat Leonard?
This would be a good point for you to cut in the video we have of the video trailer we have that's going along with the podcast. But no, we don't. It's not a video project. We were unable to because of the situation Leonard was in. We were unable to do it as a documentary. So we decided to do it as a podcast, and it also works very well because it's quite a interesting voice. He almost sounds like a raconteur, right? So it works really well as a podcast. And we should say this is not a discussion podcast. This is like a scripted podcast in a way, because I wrote Write it out so that we create the scenes of his life, and we create the scenes. There's sound effects, So when for example we describe the armed robbery he got involved in as a kid, there's sound effects, so you almost feel like you're listening to a radio play, right? But it's all true. Everything in there is true and happened. So.
You say that you started off the interview very well. But towards the end, the relationship got very testy.
Yeah.
Okay. What happened to this relationship? Which he, from the excerpts from the trailer that you have used, he sounded like someone who really sang like a bird, as I said. He was very open about it. But how did he develop into this deteriorating situation towards the end?
I think he thought that somehow he wanted to get his story out, but when my researches led to things that he didn't want to talk about, that caused this tension. It's a very typical thing in journalism, right? Yeah. Some of the stuff about like his family, you have to listen to this episode 6 to hear. is incredibly shocking and saddening. And so that caused tension. So at the end of the first episode, you'll hear his voice saying, "Are you judging me? Are you my judge?" Which is how our relationship sort of ended, with him feeling like I was judging him. When I, as a journalist, I'm not really a judge, but we will. I mean, you know this better than anyone, right?
Questions, yeah.
We will, without fear or favor, say what happened, right? And so and whether that's bad for Leonard or whether that's bad for the U.S. Navy, which I'm sure they're not very happy about this podcast either. But we need to let more light in to see what went wrong in this case and how the Navy can ensure it doesn't happen again. And you're not going to do that by not going after admirals and punishing them for their interactions with Leonard. So
I think like every of these interview subjects, they want a certain narrative to fit into their optics and to their image. And they assume that, we start off this way, not realizing that as it moves along, new evidence and new information comes out. And as a journalist, obviously, you need to ask the subject these questions, which you probably feel a bit uncomfortable.
Yeah, and for sure. I mean, he's right to say that the narrative so far that the main newspaper that's covered this is the Washington Post, and they did a really great job. The reporter Craig Whitlock did a really great job covering it. But I don't think anyone realized quite the extent to which Leonard did do a very, very good job for the Navy in terms of, protecting the fleet with this thing called the Ring of Steel or opening ports. He was very useful to them. And so, yeah, we do spend some time discussing that. But at the same time, he's an admitted criminal. So it's a fascinating thing.
Tom, when I researched on this subject, I found that most of the coverage were from the print media, with some little coverage from the TV stations. I found that it was almost in non-existence in CNN, for example. Yeah. Of course, I found that RT, Russia Today, took a dig at the American media, saying that, well, why are they covering this up? There's no coverage. Do you share that perception or that feeling that the US media is not giving as much coverage as it ought to?
Yeah, I definitely think it's been undercovered. I mean, that's one of the reasons we were very interested to go back over it. Like I said, the Washington Post did a really good job and they covered it a lot. But yeah, it definitely has not got covered as much as you would have expected, given that, we believe this is a massive national security. So for example, I mean, not to be too undecorous about the details, but Leonard organized a lot of orgies, right? In hotels, in various places. And he would record. He would set up secret cameras and karaoke machines to record the sex, but this is involving some very senior Navy officers, and he gave some of it to pictures or the videos to investigators. Some of it he still has, and he hasn't given. And then at the same time, the Russian and Chinese defense attachés in Singapore are coming and knocking on his door. So he had sexual compromat on very senior US Navy leaders. That is something that they're trained, and some of them were intelligence officers. They're trained not to land in honeypots like that, right? And so it's a massive national security failure in this case. And I think when he was arrested and he started to tell officers these stories, investigators these stories, they couldn't believe it, because how had the US Navy, the most powerful Navy in the world, allowed itself to be compromised in such a way? And I don't think anyone realizes what happened. And when this podcast comes out, people are going to be shocked.
The number of the commanders and the admirals that have been called up for investigation is pretty high. I understand there are only around 200 commanders or admirals, what they call them, but around 60 of them were called up for investigation, and maybe a few hundred officers.
Yeah, I think they looked at over 400 people. So how this worked was the Department of Justice indicted people, but the ones they decided not to indict, they passed on to the Navy. Now, some of that was to do with statute of limitations, because, after a certain number of years, you can't prosecute. So they would pass it on to the Navy. Some of it, I believe, was to do with you just don't prosecute very senior admirals. And so then the Navy set up what was called a consolidated disposition authority, which then decided what punishments to mete out. But they haven't really, I think they've only meted out one or two officers have gotten court-martial time in prison. Most of it has just been letters of censure, which is almost like a slap on the wrist, just saying, you did bad, you did some things that were dishonorable, you brought the Navy's name into disrepute. I mean, these are people who, intervened to allow Leonard to charge more for fuel, slept with prostitutes, went to expensive dinners, which isn't that dissimilar to what some of the more junior officers were doing. And so I think they call that different spanks for different ranks in the Navy. And I think a lot of the younger and more junior officers I talk to really feel like there hasn't been justice in the case because of this.
Because of these ongoing court cases, how has this affected the US Navy as a whole? And when people have been investigated or they're asked to leave on the quiet side, you will need to fill up vacancies. Has that affected the US Navy in terms of the number of personnel that you need to move in to fill up these posts?
Well, there are Navy loyalists who say the Fat Leonard scandal has actually ruined the Navy because the investigations have gone on for so long. And I think there's a tension between the Department of Justice and the Navy. The Navy wants this to go away. They want to focus back on operational tempo, on making, moving ships around and doing their job. But you can't just push stuff under the carpet. You have to figure out exactly how deep it went and punish people. Otherwise, you're not looking at it with a clear eyes, right? Definitely, people I talked to said that a lot of people's promotions were put on hold while all of this was going on. There have been reports that, people have done reports that say they lost so many good people through it. Even if you weren't caught up in it, you may have left to go to the private sector because you were sick of, your promotion was being held up and all of this kind of thing. And then, of course, there was the collisions of the ships out in Asia that happened. One off of Singapore. They had that arson attack in a ship on San Diego. So there's all this talk about the Navy having these operational troubles, and is it connected somehow to this culture of rot that the Fat Leonard scandal has exposed, and then the investigations into that? So I don't know the answer to that, but these are all interesting questions.
Tom, I'm looking forward to this podcast. You mentioned there's 6 episodes, right?
9.
Long? 9. So how long is each episode?
So each episode is about half an hour, so it's really digestible. And one thing we found with $1 Billion Whale is people really like the short chapters because it really zips along. So it's very similar. To $1 Billion Whale. It's very, very. Each episode is contained, has a theme, but it's also on a sort of chronology. And then when you get to the end, it's very exciting where Leonard has sort of corrupted an NCIS investigator, like NCIS, the famous TV show, but he corrupts the investigator, and he's able to keep one step ahead. And then, like I said, the wife, the Navy wife, who I said helps to sort of bring him down. The NCIS investigator knows that she's cooperating, so so the finale of it is extremely exciting. And then the last episode is brings it right up to today because these Navy trials are still ongoing. So at Project Brazen, we're trying to do stories like $1 Billion Whale that are still happening because we think that's the most exciting kind of nonfiction to do.
So 9 episodes. Do you, if I'm listening this, can I finish in one go all 9 episodes, or do you have to wait, or it's available all 9? So
on October the 5th, 2 episodes are going to drop, and then there'll be 1 episode every week after that. So it's going to take So it's going to take until the end of November to spin out the whole series. Yeah.
So it's available on Apple, Spotify, and
Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Okay. So Tom, thank you for having you to share the little preview of what's coming. I'm really excited with this Penang boy, okay, and this Malaysian, okay. I really look forward to it. Thank you for sharing some of these little thoughts and little ideas and information about what's happening in the US and to Fat Leonard. Thank you and good night, guys.
Cheers. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.